We do not have CART or ASL today because it was not requested. I will note that for CCDA's listening forums and webinars that are general webinars that are open to the public and not as curated as this one, we always have CART and ASL as part of our values. So you may want to think about that too as you're planning for your staff or your organization that you represent when you have a webinar or an event. Sometimes it's a good idea to think about your values around making sure that CART and ASL are included, so that you just create a universal environment when you're making your presentation. So that's something to think about. But when we have a more curated audience to save resources, we usually will just have people request the accommodation, and we have some sample accommodation language we can send out later if you have questions about that. So I will kick it over to Jan. I know that Christine grounded us a little bit in our agenda, but if Jan, you'd like to share a little bit more about what we're doing today.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. So we will be talking about building blocks for businesses and what could be considered building blocks for the City of Sunnyvale as well. And so we'll be doing some basics of the ADA, some overview. We'll be talking about Title II, state and local governments, which is specifically for the City of Sunnyvale folks to make sure that you're knowledgeable about what your requirements are under ADA Title II, and that includes effective communication. And then Title III, places of public accommodation. So that is businesses and nonprofit organizations that are open to the public. And so we'll be going over some of those obligations for Title III entities. Then we'll be at the end, as we mentioned, having a question and answer session. Please do post your questions in the Q&A block and not in the chat block. And those will be read out at the end, and April and I will do our best to answer those. And then we'll also have some available resource slides at the end, including how to contact the Pacific ADA Center and CCDA. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. So let's talk a little bit about what the California Commission on Disability Access offers. We are a 17-member commission, of which I have the pleasure of being the executive officer of. And our commissioners are appointed by the governor, the Senate Committee on Rules, and the Speaker of the Assembly for 3-year terms, and of which they can be reappointed, and there's no limit to how often you can be reappointed. We were established by the state legislature in 2009. So in addition to our business and disability appointees from those two communities, we also have the state architect, 4 state legislators who are both 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats from the Senate and the Assembly of the state legislature, as well as the Attorney General. And it's wonderful to work with them. And we were created because the business and the disability community really wanted to create a space where conversations around access could happen that wasn't a courtroom. And so while we'll talk about, people with disabilities today and their civil rights, and that one of the ways they trigger their civil rights is through litigation, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about ways that we can mitigate litigation by teaching businesses how to be accessible on the front end instead of being reactive when you get a demand letter or a lawsuit. And so we provide small business education and outreach. We produce technical materials and trainings such as this one. We come out with toolkits. We just came out with an accessible parking toolkit recently for businesses and the construction industry, for example. We also have an open air dining toolkit that's very popular. All of this can be found on our website, and I'll be chatting about that a little later in the presentation. We also conduct listening forums. These regional forums are meant to bring together local governments, people with disabilities, and local businesses to talk about how to make your community better and help build your capacity. And we also track disability access litigation related to alleged construction-related disability claims and website access claims. And we use that data to target our outreach, as well as create an annual report to the state legislature. So it gives it doesn't give a complete snapshot of disability access across California, but it gives a sense of what businesses can use our top 10 list to determine, what are the top 10 things that is happening in litigation right now that I might want to think about when I'm making my overall disability access planning. So now I will kick it to Jan to talk about what the Pacific ADA Center does.
Great. Thank you, April. So the Pacific ADA Center is part of the ADA National Network, and that's a network of 10 ADA centers across the country. Pacific ADA Center serves Region 9, which is Arizona, Nevada, California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Basin territories. So we provide technical assistance, and by that we mean informal guidance, not legal advice, by both by phone and by email. So that is important to understand that we provide technical assistance, and all the ADA centers provide that. We also provide trainings, and we provide mostly Zoom trainings these days, a lot of online trainings, but we also provide in-person training as well on the ADA and other disability civil rights laws. We do webinars, and one of the specific webinars that we do routinely is actually a healthcare webinar that we do every few months on healthcare in the ADA. So it's important to know about that is a free webinar and available to the public. And we offer other webinars and other trainings that are free and available to the public, mostly available for people with disabilities to take. And then in terms of materials, we can send people links to materials in an email if you ask us for any material that might be helpful to you, whether that's a material that we wrote or we produced, or something that CCDA produced, or something that one of the federal agencies produced. We have lots and lots of available materials that we can send to you, including videos. There is a YouTube channel that we have established recently in which we are putting our archived videos that can be available to you. And we also have a number of materials that are in other languages and that are in plain language to make it easier to really understand the law. So please contact us if you would like links to any of those materials. And a lot of that is also on our website at adapacific.org. And we will have a link to that at the end of our slides. We also typically do 2 conferences every year, one that is virtual, which we had at the end of February, and one that is in person. And we will be having our in-person conference in Sacramento on October 9th and 10th this year. So we hope that a lot of you or all of you will be able to attend our conference in person at the Sacramento Convention Center. Okay, thank you, April. Back to you.
Thanks, Jan. So let's talk about examples of disability. We're going to be talking a lot about disability today. First, we're going to talk in general about, grounding us in who are people with disabilities, and then a little later we'll talk about how the law defines disability. So it's important to note that many people have disabilities, and not all of them are physical. Some disabilities are obvious and some are not. And from a business perspective, it's important to note that people with disabilities represent $21 billion in discretionary income. It's estimated by the CDC that 1 in 4 adults have a disability. And so that's a really sometimes untapped market for businesses. But unfortunately, because of discriminatory practices and the fact that people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty or have intersectional identities that also can lead to other forms of discrimination, we're also more likely to experience a lack of services and accessibility. And it doesn't have to be that way. And we can give you a little bit more information about what we mean by that in a moment. So just think about, when you think about people with disabilities, you probably either have a disability yourself or know someone who has a disability, and you also may experience a disability later in life. So you may not have a disability now, but you may have one later, and that it's just a natural part of the human experience. Jan?
Great. So as April mentioned, those of us that have disabilities, we're not just people with disabilities. That's not our only identity. We also come from all races and ethnicities, all gender identities, all ages, all national origins. So pretty much any type of intersectionality you can mention, people with disabilities fit under that, because disability is the only minority you can join after you're born. So, it's important to understand that people with disabilities are not just their disability. They are the full person that they bring to their workplace, that they bring to the community, and that includes their disability that they bring with them. April?
Thanks, Jan. So let's talk a little bit about how to talk to people with disabilities. Well, it's always a good idea to just say hi and say their name. So, hopefully in the interaction that you're having with a customer with a disability, the disability hopefully is not the driver of that conversation. And obviously, if you get to know someone, you're going to refer to them by their name and just get to know who they are. When disability does enter into the conversation, though, we always recommend as a starting point to use people first language, and that just means that the person is first and the disability is second. So you would say a person who is blind or a person who uses wheelchairs. Remembering, this may seem obvious, but a person is not their disability. Like, we're not wheelchair people, epileptics. I won't say the R word. We're not a quadriplegic. So remember that we're people first, and it's important to emphasize ability rather than limitations, and that it's important to remember that disability is not a tragedy or a challenge to overcome. It's just a part of it's just a part of a person's identity, and everybody has challenges in their life, whether it's a disability or something else. Next slide, please. So, you want to avoid terms like wheelchair bound, special needs, differently abled, physically challenged. When I was in 7th grade, I wanted to fit in. So I was all about calling myself physically challenged, because I think all the sitcoms were starting to say that, and I was just trying to fit in with my friends. But, it sort of just emphasizes the disability and not the ability. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding, casting people as just sort of monolithic or inspirational. And if you do find people with disabilities inspirational, one thing that Jan and I have talked about is that if someone says that we're inspirational, we'll just say, really, what did I inspire you to do? And if I inspire you, I want to inspire you to make sure that businesses are accessible to people with disabilities. And now, to really trip you up, though, I told you a couple of minutes ago to use person first language, but there are some communities, particularly the neurodiverse community and the autistic communities, who don't even like person first language. They're proud of who they are. They're proud that they're neurodiverse. So they will say, I'm an autistic man or I'm an autistic woman. So as you get to know your customer base, just treat them the way that they want to be treated. Get to know them, say their name first, and as you have those communication skills with them, just tease out how they want to be referred to. And if you're not sure, just ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Jan?
Great. So kind of in that same vein of when you want to know how to talk about people, also when you want to know if you should provide assistance to people. So people with disabilities will generally ask when they need assistance. I know my disability is that I was born with an absence of all 4 limbs. So when I'm trying to get something out of my little pouch on the back of my wheelchair, it may look like I'm struggling to do that. It may look hard to you, but it is something that is important to me to be able to do independently, because I need to know that I can do it even when no one is around. So it's fine if you want to say to somebody, may I assist you? And then if the person says yes, which they may or may not say, Then you should ask how, how to provide that assistance, because you're going to need to know that they will know the best way to provide that assistance. And you may not. So ask them how to provide that assistance. And if the person does not want your assistance, like I just mentioned myself a bit ago, that it's important for me to do things independently, don't be offended. I usually try to be very gracious when I say no, thank you. Not every person with a disability will be gracious and charming. And so understand that that's okay. It's okay to ask if somebody needs assistance. But if they say no, then don't be offended by that. Just move on. Next slide. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we'll be covering as far as the Americans with Disabilities Act today. It is considered the major civil rights law for people with disabilities, passed in 1990 and signed by President George H.W. Bush. July 26th will be the 24th anniversary of it. And this picture is actually showing George H.W. Bush and disability advocates surrounding him that are, important to understand about somebody's civil rights. And the ADA protects people with disabilities from discrimination, promotes integration, and provides an equal opportunity. So that's something that is important to know about civil rights laws. And the goal of the ADA is really the full inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of American society. And that's why the disability advocates really wanted the ADA in the first place, because it was much broader than the laws that came before it. So it's very important to include people in all aspects of society. Next slide. And as I just said, on July 26th of this year, we will be celebrating the 34th anniversary of the ADA. Woohoo! And it's great that we're celebrating 34 years, but it's also, something that we're still educating people on. So as you can educate yourself, as you can educate others on the ADA, please do that, because we really need greater compliance with the ADA. We need greater integration of people with disabilities, greater opportunities in all aspects of society, and really for the ADA to fulfill its promise to the disability community. April, back to you.
Thanks, Jan. So earlier we talked a little bit about, in general, who is the disability community, and the answer is the disability community is everyone. All of us either have a disability or know someone who does, or may acquire one later in life. So let's talk a little bit about how the ADA defines disability. Under the ADA, the disability is defined very broadly on purpose. It can include physical, developmental, psychiatric, cognitive, intellectual, learning, vision, hearing, speech, also addiction, but the person has to be in recovery, and also health disabilities. We're all sort of just, I know we're all still sort of amidst COVID, where the world has opened back up for the last year or two now, but we have a lot of community members who are experiencing, long COVID, and that could also be a disability as defined by the ADA. Also, some disabilities are not constant, like I will be using a wheelchair for the rest of my life because of the disability I was born with. But some people have disabilities that can flare up, things, or they have cancer or HIV/AIDS. And so it's important to note that disability is very diverse, and that one size does not fit all. Not everybody has a disability you can see, and you don't want to make harmful assumptions. So, and many people don't even know that they fit under the definition of disability. When I was a service provider in Northern California, before I worked for the state, I worked with a lot of older adults who would say, well, I need a cane, or I need help with reading, but I don't have a disability, when actually they would be covered under the ADA as having a disability. Or I would talk a lot with a lot of college students. Services are becoming really normalized now for college students, which is wonderful. But sometimes the college students don't realize that they're a part of a rich community of people with disabilities that could help them with their future goals. And so they may They may say, well, I need extra time on tests, but I don't have a disability. When in fact, if they learn more about how the ADA defines disability, they might be able to advocate for themselves better. And as I mentioned earlier, according to the CDC, 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. Jan?
Okay, so now that we've learned a little bit about how the ADA describes disability, let me just quickly go over what the titles of the ADA are. And we're not going to be going into a huge amount of detail on all of these titles. We're really touching on most of them. But we wanted you to know that the ADA does have 5 titles. Title 1 is employment and does deal with everything from applying for a job through interviewing to on the job, even in retirement. Title 2 is public entities. So that's state and local government agencies. And so City of Sunnyvale is included in Part A of Title 2. Also, Part B of Title 2 includes public transportation, like the public buses, public light rail services. And so that's all included under Title 2. Title 3, as we mentioned earlier, is public accommodations. So that's private businesses and private nonprofits that are open to the public. So anything that you do that is open to the public, you fall under ADA Title 3, regardless of how many employees you have, regardless of how many sites you have, you fall under ADA Title 3. And then Title 4 includes telecommunications, which is mainly how people who are deaf or hard of hearing and or have speech disabilities can communicate with other people using the relay service or video relay. But it also includes access to 911, which is a critical service for everyone. And then Title 5 of the ADA is miscellaneous and has a lot of different miscellaneous sections as its name implies, but it also includes enforcement of the ADA. And so that's part of what we'll be talking about in a little bit too, in terms of how the ADA is enforced. Next. So the ADA Title II, as I mentioned, covers public entities. So that's Part A, state and local governments, and Part B, public transportation. That's not private transportation. That's not things like airport shuttles or hotel shuttles. That is really public buses, public light rail, public commuter rail. Amtrak would be included in Title II, Part B. And then state and local government agencies are included in Part A of Title II. There are public access requirements in Title II. So what that means is you have to provide equal or equivalent access to programs, services, and facilities that are part of that Title II entity. So not every facility, not every building has to be accessible when it's part of a Title II agency, but every program does have to be accessible. Also, reasonable modification of policies, practices, and procedures are required. And proof of disability is not required when you request a reasonable modification. So you may have a non-apparent or non-obvious disability. You can still ask for a reasonable modification. And if it is reasonable and not what the ADA calls a fundamental alteration, the public entity should not be asking you to prove that you need that reasonable modification of policy, practice, or procedure. An example might be you might have diabetes, and that's not obvious when you just look at someone, but you may need to take a snack in with you into the library. But the library has a policy that says people can't bring food into the library. Well, if you say, I might need a snack because I might get low blood sugar due to my diabetes, you should allow that without requiring people to provide a doctor's letter saying they have diabetes. So that's one example of what a policy modification at a Title II entity could cover. April?
Thanks, Jan. Now let's talk about ADA Title III, which covers small businesses serving the public, also known as places of public accommodation. So the ADA Title III covers places of public accommodation, businesses open to the public. And you may not know that if you are a social service organization or a retail store or a restaurant, those are just some examples. And it includes all types of private businesses and nonprofit organizations, no matter how many employees they have. So I do get questions a lot about how many employees do you have to have for this to be triggered? And it doesn't matter how many employees you have. And this covers nonprofits as well. So, Jan?
Yeah, and the only time the number of employees matters is when we're talking about employment, and I mentioned that earlier, Title I, and so yeah, that's not a requirement in Title III. So one thing that actually is required by both state and local government agencies, so Title II as well as public accommodations, Title III, you have to provide effective communication to people with communication related disabilities. And those communication related disabilities include hearing, vision, and or speech disabilities. So you have to make sure your communication to people with those disabilities is as effective as it is to people without disabilities or even with other non-communication related disabilities. April?
Thanks, Jan. So here's some examples of effective communication for people with vision disabilities. You may have heard the term alternate format. That could be providing a file in electronic format, large print, braille, making sure that your websites are accessible to screen readers. Just a quick plug, CCDA will be coming out with a website FAQ in about a couple of months. By the end of 2024, we will have an FAQ about website accessibility for businesses. And we'll have a subsequent webinar for that. Also, providing qualified readers to convey technical information. Now, if you're a restaurant and a person just needs assistance with reading menus or something like that, you don't actually have to have the owner of the restaurant or the chef come out to read it. It's only when the information is really technical, like if it's a person who's like reading architectural plans or something, you want a person who's qualified to read that to that person, not just somebody who if I tried to, read engineering speak, people would die. So I wouldn't be the qualified reader for that. I also really recommend, I recommend to local governments and state governments, as well as businesses, to develop relationships with vendors who can create these formats for you. In many cases, your local Center for Independent Living might know who could produce your menus in Braille, for example, or who could help you print things in large print, or how to make a PDF. So get to know your community organizations that are run for and by people with disabilities, and get to know vendors, and have a couple people in your electronic Rolodex. And it's always good to have, copies of things ready to go, because you never know if someone's going to ask for these things. And so it's good to have the things that you give out regularly, like your regular brochure or something like that. Make sure you have at least one Braille or large print or electronic copy of those things, so that they're just good to go, and that you have technical assistance available from vendors who can help you produce these things. So it's all about relationship building. Thank you.
Great. And as April was giving some examples of effective communication for people with vision disabilities, there's also effective communication types of services and technology for people with hearing disabilities. So sign language interpreters is something that people think of a lot, and not every person who is deaf, or certainly not every person who is hard of hearing, actually reads sign language. So you really need to know what the person needs to make that communication effective for them. If they do need sign language interpreters, you need to know, is it possible to do that in person, which is usually the best situation, if you're having an in-person meeting or encounter, or if you don't have time to schedule those interpreters, you may want to do video remote interpreting. A lot of libraries have video remote interpreting because they don't know that someone deaf may be coming to ask them about a particular book or a particular event that they're having at the library. And so they can use video remote interpreting for that when they're not expecting the person. But then when they would have that event, when they scheduled that, if the person who is deaf wants to come to that event, that's when you would hire in-person interpreters to make sure that they were there to interpret during an event if someone needed that to be able to provide effective communication. And like April was talking earlier about developing relationships with vendors, make sure you have contracts for your in-person and video remote interpreting sign language interpreters, because you can't just literally call them up and hire them on that day. You have to have contracts in place, and they need to know in advance. The best thing is to schedule them in advance, and then if you don't need them, cancel them within the amount of time that the contract provides if nobody has requested them. But certainly you need to make sure that you're making it very prominent on all your outreach materials that you are providing effective communication accessibility, and here's how people should request it if they want that, so that you can make sure that people do know they can request this information. Then, as I mentioned earlier, people who are hard of hearing, or maybe who became deaf later in life or hard of hearing later in life, they often will need real-time captioning. And that often is best delivered through an actual in-person captioner or CART services. There are actually online auto captioning services, but they often are not very good. They don't caption well. And they really can misunderstand people who have accents or maybe who have CP as a disability. So the best thing is really to get an in-person captioner whenever possible. Another option is the relay service when somebody calls and needs to use the phone. So making sure that people know that that's not a robocall, that that's a real thing, a relay service call, and that you should not hang up on the relay service when they call you, because that is somebody with a speech or a hearing disability that is calling you. Also, you could write notes to somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing in the moment, but when that's just a really simple, brief conversation, writing notes back and forth can be sufficient. But it's not sufficient for a meeting, not sufficient for a training, not sufficient for a long conversation, not sufficient for a complex conversation like buying a house or buying a car, something like that. You want to have the type of communication the person needs for complex communications. April?
Thanks, Jan. Let's talk about how to provide accessibility for people with mobility disabilities. And on the right, you see a woman in a wheelchair who has blonde hair. She's wearing jeans and a green shirt, and she's really struggling with this big, heavy door. Not only does it not have push buttons, but it also, the door force is clearly too heavy, and she's going to fall out of her chair in a moment. Hopefully not, but that's kind of what the image is implying. Remember to have the right amount of accessible parking. When we conducted our 2022 analysis of our litigation data, we found that accessible parking was really trending in regions across California as far as what litigants are suing businesses for. And so we created our accessible parking campaign. If you want to hear more about that, you can go to our website, and shortly we will have some materials related to accessible parking available on our website for business owners, facility owners, and construction industry leaders. Remember to have no-step entrances with wide, easy, open doors. And remember that in California, the door opening force has to be 5 pounds or less. So if you're unable to afford a push button through a grant or other means, at least release the door force. I know when I'm trying to open the door it's just a lot easier for me to maneuver when the door is the door force is less than 5 pounds. So remember that, test that out. Think about your interior accessible paths. So like, for example, if you own a cafe or you own a gift shop, for example, think about what that customer's experience is going to be from the moment, even before they step into your shop, to the moment they walk in. What if they need to use the bathroom? Are there, are there baby chairs in the way? Are there, if you it's like is the interior path of travel blocked by too many chairs, debris, remember that if you own a hotel or a bar or other businesses that have counters and bar service, remember that lowered portion of that counter or bar is not for brochures, and it's not a place to put dirty dishes or your point of sale machine. I remember I went to one of my favorite bars in town a couple weeks ago, and they saw me coming, and I wheeled right up to the accessible bar to order my drink, because that was the only way to make that accessible to me. And it was cut out, and it's a table. It's meant to be a place to sit, but they had their point of sale machine there, and they were kind of using that as their service ground zero. So that's not a good idea. So just remember, keep those accessible counters and bars clean. They do serve a purpose of seating for people with disabilities. Also, accessible restrooms. Think twice before you put that giant potted plant or that really cool, what you think might be like a really cool sconce or a really cool, I see this a lot now, just a lot of extra storage, from like West Elm or something. Just remember that could affect the turn radius if somebody needs to use the toilet, or they may not be able to get under, even through the door or underneath the sink, for example. So keep your accessible restrooms free of a lot of frilly things. You could always hang, a nice picture or something that conveys your place of business in the, like the Folsom History Museum has a really cool Johnny Cash bathroom, but nothing is blocking. So that's an example. Just keep your accessible restrooms accessible, and avoid a lot of the things that you think might be aesthetic, but could really harm someone's ability to use the restroom.
Yeah, and I would just say make sure that the restrooms are big, or the accessible toilet stall is big for a reason. It's so that people can actually turn around, that they can transfer to the toilet. It's not just to have this huge room. It's to allow greater access. So that's why, it's important what April was saying. Don't put extra furniture, don't store your toilet paper in the accessible stall. Don't obstruct that big area just because you think, oh, this looks like a big, lovely area. Well, it's big and lovely because it is actually providing access. And being able to maintain your accessible features is so important once you have them. Next slide. So I know we want to talk a little bit also. April was talking about your interior accessible routes and making sure that those are accessible, which is really important and really critical. But you also have an obligation to actually have accessibility from what are called site arrival points. And site arrival points can be your accessible parking, if you have parking at all. And if you do have parking at all, you are required to have at least one accessible parking space, and the number will depend on the total number of parking spaces that you have. And so you will be required to have at least one van accessible space. And that's showing in this picture with the access aisle next to it and somebody coming out of the van using a ramp. So from that access aisle all the way to the entrance of the building, you're required to have a clear accessible route. Also, from the street or sidewalk, you're required to have a clear, accessible route. That street or sidewalk may also include some kind of transit stop, a light rail stop, a bus stop. Make sure that stop is accessible, and make sure you have a good route to it, and that you have an accessible route from that stop to the building entrance, or at least from the sidewalk, even if there's no transit stop, to the building entrance. And then you want to make sure that once you are at the door, that the door meets all the clearance requirements, is wide enough, meets the requirements for opening force, all those things that April was talking about earlier. So I know you might think about making sure that your interior spaces are accessible, but also really make sure that your exterior, every side arrival point that you have, make sure that you have an accessible route from that point to the accessible entrance. And if you have a big building with multiple accessible entrances and multiple parking spaces and multiple side arrival points, you need to think about an accessible route. You need to what's called disperse those accessible parking spaces, disperse those accessible routes to make sure that you are giving people an accessible route option to every accessible entrance.
Thanks, Jan. Let's talk about service animals. Again, when I was a service provider at a disability advocacy nonprofit, the number one question I would receive from business owners or state and local governments was, how do I know something's a service animal? What are my obligations? What am I allowed to ask? What am I not allowed to ask? What if they're not housebroken? It was our number one training we always did. So under the ADA, service animals are dogs, though sometimes, in some cases, miniature horses may be allowed. So you see a picture of a miniature horse wearing tennis shoes and three Labrador retrievers all in vests. They are trained to do one or more physical tasks for their handlers. Now, this is different than an emotional support animal, and I think these two phrases get conflated a lot. In California, you're allowed to have an emotional support animal that may not be a dog, live with you in your apartment and provide emotional support to you. But emotional support is not a task under the ADA. Some businesses have decided, like some coffee shops that I go to, for example, they've decided that they are going to exceed the federal standard and allow emotional support animals to come in. But that's the decision of the business to make. If they're going to exceed the standard. They must be under control, housebroken, and well-behaved. If they're not housebroken, if they're going to the bathroom in your business, or they're causing a disturbance for customers, they're not being a service animal anymore. They've violated what a service animal is when they do that. So they're like not a service animal anymore when they do that. They must be under leash, tether, or if a leash or tether is not permitted or not allowed because of a disability, like if somebody can't use a leash or tether because of their disability, then the animal must be under voice control. Next slide, please. So what are the questions government or businesses can ask? There are only 2 questions under the ADA that you're allowed to ask. Is the animal required because of a disability? And don't ask if the disability is obvious. And what work or tasks has the animal been trained to perform? What you never do is you never ask about the handler's disability or ask to see the task performed. If you ask for a demo of the task, you're actually interrupting that relationship between the handler and the service dog or horse. You're causing that animal to have to think on command about something that's not natural, and you're also potentially making it dangerous or inaccessible for the person that is the handler by treating their dog like a showpiece. You don't want to do that. Next slide, please. So what proof? What about all those vests you can download off Amazon? It's important to know that, the certificates and vests and ID cards you see all the time, they're not necessary to prove an animal is a service animal. There's no such thing as a service animal ID. There are some reputable companies like Canine Companions or Guide Dogs for the Blind that they give you those, as part of their marketing and to kind of, build that public trust, but they're not required to have those. And some of those vests that you can print out or certificates, they're not worth the paper or the fabric they're printed on. If the handler answers those 2 questions for you, you don't have to ask. You don't ask for proof. So please don't do that. Just ask those 2 questions. You're also allowed under the law to train your own animals. The reason handlers are allowed to train their own service animal is because the waiting list for service animals can be long. and also very expensive. Not everybody can afford to be away from work to go, live at the canine companion facility, for example. I had a friend who did that, but she was able to get the time off. A lot of people can't afford the initial investment or the time off to do that, so they have to train their own animals. And also, you may see service animals in training, like at Safeway or other stores. Service animals in trainings are allowed in California. And part of the reason why I recommend, well, not just recommend, it's allowed in California, but the reason why it's a good thing for your business to allow service animals in training, other than it's the law, is that you're allowing that service animal to get all the training they need ahead of time so that when their handler does come to your business, they can access it with their animal, and their animal has learned how to access lots of different businesses and make it a part of their training. Jan?
Great. Thank you. So and I'll just add one thing to service animals, just to say that, remember when April talked about control, and that, if once the person's answered the 2 questions, that's all the questions you can ask. But if the animal is out of control, you do have the right to be able to ask that it be removed from the premises. The person with the disability gets to come back and partake of the goods and services, but the animal you can exclude if it is not under control. And April talked about what those control areas are. So in addition to service animals, in addition to effective communication, in addition to the physical accessibility that we talked about, plan for the accessibility in every way of your business or your state or local government agency. Designate a responsible staff person. State and local government agencies are required to have an ADA coordinator, but even private businesses and private nonprofits could designate a site ADA coordinator, somebody who knows more about the ADA, who has studied up on it, who's learned about it, and who can help make sure that things are physically accessible, make sure that reasonable modifications are made when necessary, make sure they know about service animal rules, all of that. Designate that responsible staff person who will be your person, who will know about how to comply with the ADA and with state law as well. Also, you can create checklists and duty sheets to make sure that you're following all the law. Often people will use checklists for their physical accessibility of their area, but you can use checklists to make sure you've met all your effective communication obligations, etc. Also, you may want to post a poster, and they have these. I've seen these at a lot of grocery stores, that service animals are allowed. You may want to post a poster that says, we do allow service animals here. And that just shows people with disabilities that use service animals that you know about service animals, and that person with the disability will be welcome, and their service animal will also be welcome. Also, consider additional signage to make sure people know where the accessible areas are. If you've got multiple bathrooms, for example, and not all of them are accessible, you really have to identify the one that is accessible. So, and consider additional signage, particularly when it's a large area that you're going to want to make sure people know how to get around. Use the signage as much as possible to direct people where to go. Also, evaluate your facilities for future uses. Don't just think about what may be accessible today. Think about, what may need to be accessible for the future, and what changes you're going to be making for the future to make sure that things are accessible as possible, and that you can remove barriers to accessibility going forward. And make sure that you're budgeting for your facility accessibility, but also for your communication access. Make sure that you have money set aside so that you can hire those interpreters. You can hire that real-time captioning. You can remove those architectural barriers as you move forward. So don't just say, oh, well, I don't have the money. No, you really need to think about and plan and budget for it. And that's going to really help you in the long run. And it's going to make people with disabilities feel welcome. in your agency or in your place of business.
Thanks, Jan. And so now we've come to the Q&A portion of the presentation, and staff are going to assist us. We also received some questions in advance, so if there's not a lot of action in the Q&A, we can go to those questions. But let's start if anyone has any questions in the Q&A first. I'm seeing that someone asked if there's a handout for the webinar, and the answer is that we'll make sure that we provide a copy of this. This is being recorded, but we'll also give a copy of the PowerPoint to Sunnyvale City staff so that they can send it out to all the attendees. And if there's any follow-up questions that we didn't answer, you can go to either one of our websites and contact us. And in a moment after the Q&A portion, we'll share how to get in contact with us. But there was a question that was asked in advance about what are the legal protections afforded to a business that hires a CASP. So it's important to note that a CASP stands for Certified Access Specialist, and they're a professional who has passed an exam and has been certified by the state of California to have specialized knowledge of state and federal construction-related access standards. And so you may receive certain benefits if you are involved in a lawsuit and hire a CASP. And so if only a CASP can provide services that offer you a qualified defendant status in a construction-related accessibility lawsuit. And so some of the benefits that may apply to you under the qualified defendant status is reduced statutory damages, or a 90-day stay of court proceedings, and an early evaluation conference. So you have some opportunities to solve the problem before it gets more expensive for you. And all inspections by a CASP and following the schedule of improvements demonstrates your intent to be in compliance. So one of the things I hear a lot is, well, I'm scared to even talk about access or even make access improvements because the minute that I do, what if I become a target of a lawsuit? It's always in a business or a city or state government's best interest to think about access on the front end and not on the back end. Don't wait to get sued. So Jan already talked earlier about ways that you can input checks and balances about how your accessibility part of your business is doing, such as the duty sheets, the person who is the person sort of in charge of making sure access happens. One thing that I see happen because of budget shortfalls and other things is sometimes the accessibility piece of a business or a state and local government falls to one person who may not have a lot of support. Obviously in the city of Sunnyvale, they're awesome and they're doing that. But, just think about if you're a representative of a state or local government or a business, and we all know that resources are short, but try to make sure to remember that access starts with all of us. And so even though you might have a designated ADA coordinator or a designated manager that does the checks of the path of travel, interior and exterior, and helps making sure they check off that the accessible features are being maintained, it's not just on that person. It's all of our responsibility to see something and say something. So I know I expanded a little bit about on that, but those are some examples of legal protections. And my overall point is it's always better to think about access on the front end. And when you work with a CASP, you may be able to, if you do have the unfortunate happening of getting sued or getting a demand letter, just being able to demonstrate that you have been working toward access and the efforts that you've been making, that is going to help you.
It does help you with the court and yeah, if you unfortunately do get sued and it doesn't, nothing will prevent you from being sued. Unfortunately, the best thing to prevent a lawsuit against yourself is to be very proactive, to make your business or your nonprofit or your state or local government as accessible as possible, to train your staff to be very welcoming and to show people how you're trying to be more accessible. And so that people, if they do experience a problem, that they will actually come to you first and raise the problem with you because they see that you are, they understand that you are somebody that is really trying and really welcomes people with disabilities into their state or local government agency or into their business or nonprofit. And so they're more likely to engage in that dialogue with you and form a relationship with you rather than sue you in the first instance. So we can't prevent you from being sued, but we certainly, there's a lot you can do that will hopefully deter that. And it just makes access better for everyone when you do that.
And I also recommend that businesses form a relationship with local nonprofits that serve people with disabilities. Every region in California has what's called a Center for Independent Living. And in the Silicon Valley region, it's the Silicon Valley Independent Living Center. And I think that their website is svilc.org. And, you know, they have events, they have they have a lot of events that businesses can come to. You could contact them and talk with their executive director or their community organizer to talk about, hey, we're having this wine and dine night coming up. How can we make that accessible to people with disabilities? Or how can we make sure your consumers that you serve know about this event that we're having? And I find, as Jan was saying, that as if business owners get to know their community, which includes people with disabilities, it does head off those conversations, because it's a lot harder to see someone in a silo when they've been to your yogurt shop, or they've been to your gift shop, or they've been to your restaurant or your gas station, or they know who the manager is because they come to Rotary or they come to the IL fundraiser or things like that. So we did have another question, and so someone was concerned. I know that there's a lot of municipalities are moving toward pedestrian malls, you know, closing off streets and things like that. And someone wrote in that they were concerned about how, you know, why they have to have the path of travel distance between the tables, and worries that some of the pedestrian mall requirements for access and path of travel take away from their ability to have extra tables. So I don't know if Jan, you want to speak to that or talk about why that's important or what they need to think about.
Well, it is important to have accessible routes, you know, exterior and interior. And we kind of talked about that earlier. And just to try to space your tables and chairs so that people can, it doesn't have to be all straight in a row, but that there's at least, you know, the width, you know, generally a sidewalk in California has to be 48 inches wide. But you may be able to, you know, have an accessible route that's 36 inches wide. But I would say whenever possible, try to make your route, whether it's interior or exterior, 48 inches wide when you can. And just make sure that there is actually that clear width, even if it has to wind around tables a little bit, so that people who use mobility devices can be able to go there. And that will also make your area be more attractive. Actually, having a space is really, it makes everyone feel better, having a greater level of space rather than all these tables and chairs that are crammed together. So try to just use the excuse for access to make everything, you know, be more welcoming and available.
And if you have questions about, we do have I know that Pacific ADA does also, but speaking for CCDA, we do have our state architect as one of our commissioners, and their team provides a lot of technical assistance help to businesses. They have a technical assistance line. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but if you write to CCDA, if you have like specific building code requirements about like what the width has to be and those kinds of things, we can get that answer for you. Another person asked, hey, what about grandfathering, Jan? I know this is a big one. I hear this a lot that, well, my building was built in, 1797, so I don't have to comply with the ADA. What say us about that?
Yeah. Well, it's important to know that actually there is no such thing as grandfathering under the California Building Code or under the ADA or any other accessibility requirements. There are such things as buildings that are qualified historic buildings, And you do have some things that you're allowed to do. Some, you can make a door maybe a little bit less wide, or you can make one accessible restroom that's single gender instead of a two gender restroom, if you need more space to make it more accessible. So there are certain things that the California Historical Building Code allows you to do for historic buildings in California. And if you just can't possibly get somebody to the higher floors in a building, being able to offer some sort of access, like a video of what's on those higher floors, somehow a description what's happening there, would be really, really helpful. If there's just no way to put in an elevator or allow people to get up to those higher floors. So, but there is no such thing as grandfathering for any building at all. It's you either have California Historical Building Code information, or you need to comply with what you're required to comply with today, or you have barrier removal requirements. So you need to remove barriers as you can, as it's readily achievable. If you are a private business, you need to be able to remove those barriers as much as possible. Or if you are a state and local government, you need to have your program accessibility, making sure all your programs are accessible. That's not being grandfathered either.
Thanks, Jan. So I wanted to share some financial resources. I know Presley is going to put up on the screen some of our resources. Let's talk about some financial and other resources. So there's a primer for small business. If you go to ada.gov, that's a Title III primer. There's also, if you go to ada.gov, there's some really great fact sheets on service animals and effective communication, a lot of what we covered in today's presentation. Next slide, please. Also, the ADA National Network has a lot of information about quick tips and tax incentives. And if you want to find a certified access specialist or learn more about what a certified access specialist can do for your business, you could go to dgs.ca.gov /Division of the State Architect, and they have a really great resources page. You can also go to CCDA's website, which is dgs.ca.gov/CCDA. You can email us or call us, and we're a public agency, so we're able to respond to public inquiries. And then I'll turn it over to Jan to talk about how to get in touch with the Pacific ADA Center, and then I want to talk about a source of funding that may be of interest to municipalities.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those resources, April. And we know you all will get the slides, so you'll have those resources. And there are many, many more, as I talked about. Both CCDA and the Pacific ADA Center have many resources we can share with you. And remember that as a small business, you may be entitled to a lot of tax incentives, as April pointed out as well. So this is how you reach us with our physical address, our phone number. We have a toll-free number, 1-800-949-4232. You can also reach us by email at info@adapacific.org. And you can explore our website at adapacific.org. We just recently revamped our website. It is in plain language, and it should be fairly easy to navigate based on audience and based on topic. So we encourage you to really go there and navigate. And we've got resources on each one of our web pages as well. And then you can, if you're not finding the resource you want or not finding the information you want, you are welcome to call us. We have real people that answer the phone at our 800 number during the week. So feel free to call us, or you can email us, and we will respond to you almost always within 48 hours. So we make a real effort to respond to everyone and to respond quickly. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. That's the link on the right-hand side, adapacific.org/subscribe. And we really encourage you to do that, because we actually have a monthly newsletter that has a lot of really excellent information, not only on resources, but also on trainings that are coming up from our trainings at the ADA Center, the ADA National Network trainings, the trainings that we do in concert with CCDA. And so we really encourage you to sign up for that newsletter. And that will also allow you to get other information about things that we offer, our conferences, for example, and other kinds of resources that are coming out all the time. So please do sign up and stay in touch with us.
Thanks, Jan. This is April. And also for CCDA, making sure that you know that we have quarterly meetings that are open to the public. They're all Bagley Keen, which means they're subject to the Open Meeting Act. So there's opportunity for public comment. Our next full commission meeting will be on June 26th near the Irvine Airport, but we also, all of our meetings are hybrid as well. So you could also join on Zoom. We also have subcommittees that many public members have joined where you could weigh in on the work that we do. And like I mentioned earlier, our website has a lot of great information. We also have a newsletter as well that we try to send out every other month or so. It's a really great opportunity to learn a little bit more about what we do and engage with us. So you could go to our website and sign up for our mailing list so you can get all this great information. And we also have a partnership with Pacific ADA where we're having some quarterly webinars. So look out for that information as well, and also look out for our new toolkits. And our next listening forum will be taking place in Orange County to coincide with our full commission meeting on June 26th. So we're excited about that. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the Disability Access Education and Revolving Fund. And I know that that's going to be put on the flyer for that. It's going to be put on the screen in a moment. But the Disability Access Education and Revolving Fund is managed by the Division of the State Architect. And what happens is $4 of every business license or building permit fee, depending on how the city or county municipality sets up their business license fees, $4 of each of those fees goes into a fund, and 10% of the fund goes back to the Division of the State Architect for administrative costs and education and going toward them managing the CASP program. But the other piece of it, and Presley has that up on the screen, and I'll talk about. I'm just reading out what it says. 10% of the fund goes back to the Division of the State Architect for their administering of the CASP program and the exam and technical assistance line and everything. But 90% of the fund stays with each municipality. So the municipality is required to maintain that fund. The very first use of the fund must be training and retention of CASPs. And so each building department is required to have at least one CASP on staff. So for example, the City of San Diego has a really great program called Ask a CASP, where you can go on the website, ask a dedicated question to their CASP, and somebody on the building department will respond to that business. So that's one example of how a municipality has used their funds from this program to set up that website. Also, the City of San Diego has a program called Spaces as Places, where they have done a lot of open air dining access improvements, and they have a grant program for businesses to provide access improvements. So in the past, you can only use this fund for the training and retention of CASPs, but now municipalities, many of them, because the law recently changed, they're able to use a portion of the fund toward creating programs and to educate businesses and help businesses make it easier for them to hire a CASP or to pay for the cost of the CASP inspection or access improvements that result from that CASP inspection. So for example, the City of San Jose is a model of a grant program that was stood up with these funds. And so whenever we talk with municipalities and businesses, I always like to bring up that this fund is available and statewide, and you may want to ask your municipality, how they're working with these funds, or if you have questions on how to afford a CASP, you can contact Jan or myself, and we can send you to resources that may be in your area to help you with the cost of that CASP evaluation and how a CASP works. So I just wanted to share that. And this QRG that's up on the screen is available on the CCDA website as well. And that was it with the questions. Or were there any other questions or anything that anyone would like us to cover before we end our time today? And then if not, I can kick it back to Christine.
And I do apologize for my hoarse voice today. I was in Los Angeles yesterday speaking with several different people. And so I apologize for that today.
No, you sound great.
Okay, it looks like we do not have any further questions. So this concludes our session today. Wanted to, of course, thank April and Jan for sharing this very important information on ADA compliance, as well as the resources. I hope everyone benefited by today's session. And with that, wanted to wish you a great rest of the day.